All right, it's good to see everybody on a Monday night. Appreciate you coming out to hear more of how we got the Bible, and didn't scare you away yesterday so much. The difficulty with this whole series is every time I present it, the toughest lessons are the first three, and then we get to the fun ones, 4, 5, and 6, and yet all three were scrunched together in back-to-back hours yesterday, and but you've come for some of the best part, because we're now going to be able to slow down just a little bit and look at some major periods and ask ourselves what was happening with the Bible, particularly in the Middle Ages tonight. On September 4th, AD 476. The Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. And that kind of traditionally dates the end of the age of antiquity, the classical age, and the beginning of the Middle Ages. It's the traditional end of the Western Roman Empire, even though the eastern portion of the empire continued on with Constantinople, modern Istanbul. Odoacer did not appoint a new emperor, but it declared himself king of Italy, shifting political power from Rome to Germanic rule. This in turn paved the way for the Western Church to take advantage of the power vacuum. The Eastern Orthodox Catholic churches would eventually have to battle it out with the Muslims. But in the West, you have this power vacuum, and there were already several major steps taken that would ultimately crystallize into the Roman Catholic Church. But the Germanic tribes conquering Italy put that into overdrive. And so you have this huge vacuum, and the medieval period continued on for the next 1,000 years, until the Renaissance and the Reformation and so on, the 15th century, which in turn set the stage for the Protestant Reformation. The Renaissance did. And so I've collected a lot of personal items that relate to this period. One of them is this giant sheepskin manuscript. Dates from the late Middle Ages. It comes from a medieval monastery. It's on parchment. It's a Vespers reading of one of the Psalms, an evening prayer reading, Latin Vulgate. And I preached this lesson, in the series all over the country in a couple of places where there were medieval experts. That puts major pressure on me because I'm not, really. I have an interest in the period, and I enjoy reading about it and putting together a lesson and so on. But in Folsom, California, where my good friend David Posey preaches, there is a guy that went to Yale, did some graduate work in medieval studies, and he translated this thing for me. And because not only is it in Latin, but it's in Latin lettering that is so bizarre that I couldn't even read some of the letters on it. And he translated the whole thing for me, and we've displayed it in some of our little Bible museum presentations and so on. And I did this series also in Arkansas, where Chuck Durham preaches, and they have a PhD that teaches at the University of Arkansas in the medieval studies. And she gave me good kudos on the lesson, so I hope I'm on the right track at least with that. But I want to recap just briefly to kind of set the stage for what we're going to be doing tonight. Introduced Bart Ehrman last night, one of the world's leading skeptics. He grew up in an evangelical home and lost faith when he was a relatively young man, and taken on a mission in life to beat out the faith out of thousands of young people. He's written a lot of books, and I cited misquoting Jesus last night, and also this little blurb that was in an appendix of one version of that book, talking about Bruce Metzger, his mentor. If he and I were put in a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement, maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands. And again, I pointed out last night that in a rare moment of honesty, Bart Ehrman is suggesting that we can reconstruct the New Testament text with near 100% accuracy. The variance, the textual variance between manuscripts, the discrepancies that you occasionally see, and these are handwritten manuscripts, so you're going to have human error that enters the picture. Most of the time, they're minor. There are a couple of biggies. End of Mark 16, the beginning of John 8, the woman caught in adultery and all of that. And you have manuscript differences on some of those. But most of the time, they are relatively minor issues like this one. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 1, and it's pretty much 50-50. You have some manuscripts that say Simeon Petros and others that say Simon Petros, Simon Peter, spelled 2 different ways. And interestingly enough, we're going to talk a little bit about John Wycliffe tonight. We'll talk a little bit about William Tyndale tomorrow night. And there are variations on how Tyndale was spelled. There are variations on how Wycliffe was spelled. And so it shouldn't surprise us if there are variations on Simeon or Simon Peter and how the spelling of that would have gone. But it really doesn't make a whole lot of difference, does it? You still translate that Simon Peter. And so when you're looking at these New Testament Greek manuscripts, there are several things the experts look at that we might not notice with the untrained eye. Writing materials as artifacts, codex versus scrolls, writing style. You have different scribes that did the writing. You have pinpricks, where you have line justification. And they would use the pinpricks to make lines and justify margins and make nice straight lines and so on. You have line and page count in some cases, which implies a professional scribe. Corrections by editors, and especially in the margins. Sacred names, we talked a little bit about that last night. Marginal doodles, especially at the end of a book. This is an example from the Codex Claromontanus from the 5th century, 6th century perhaps, that has line count. And I don't know if you can see this really well, but in the second line you see Genesis. In the third line, Exodus, then Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. This is all in Latin, but you can kind of make it out maybe if you've got good eyes. And then to the right of each of those books is a number. So you've got Genesis, the number 4,500, 4,500. Exodus, 3,700. What those are is lines that it took to produce each of those books. And the reason you have that is because someone was paid so much money per line. So unlike the statement that Bart Ehrman made that I quoted last night, you don't just have amateur scribes. In some cases, you have people paid to write these things. And there's so much pay for so many lines. And again, we looked at this marginal comment last night in the Codex Vaticanus, Fool and Knave, can't you leave the old reading alone and not alter it? They wanted to get it right. Again, this is in a major manuscript, and you have this kind of statement in the margin. But my favorite example of this, it comes from a medieval manuscript where the scribe left out a word. And so you have the word in the margin, and you have an animal and a man that are going to transport that word to the place where another man is pointing, rather than rewrite the whole page. And so, again, you're going to transport the word to where it belongs, because rewriting that whole page is major effort and time and money and everything else. Again, they at least tried to get it right. If they missed a word, okay, we've got a major correction. How can we make this artistic and not look like such a glaring mistake? Respect for biblical authority drove the process. In general, there was a tendency to be careful and respectful of the text. No additions, no deletions, no tampering, no alterations whatsoever. The focus would be primarily on the sacredness of the text itself, without drawing attention to peripheral issues. In the earliest manuscripts, it was not style over substance. And so if you were to look at a whole bunch of these Greek manuscripts, the New Testament Greek, you might be bored with them, because it's just the text, basically. I mean, you have these little peripheral things going on. But when you get into the medieval period, you get into really ornate manuscripts. And the difference between these early Greek manuscripts of the New Testament in the Antiquity period versus the ornate manuscripts of the medieval period is like the difference between walking into a humble meeting place that has no frills versus walking into a cathedral. And this is the literary counterpart to that. Because as you get into the Middle Ages, the manuscripts become fancier and fancier. We can reconstruct the original text with near 100% accuracy. That's the main point, main takeaway from last night. But there was an additional quality control measure. And I want to talk just briefly about that. Communal reading events were widespread in the Roman Empire. In fact, it was a form of entertainment. I've read an entire book on this one subject, and people would get together for a few hours at a time, and someone would get up and read. People have made a big deal about, the literacy rates may not have been that high in some cases, although for Christians they became eventually a lot higher than the general populace, because if you became a Christian, you wanted to be able to read this book. And so Christians kind of set the pace with literacy rates in later centuries. But even if it is true to a certain extent, perhaps, that not everybody could read, people would read with their ears. You'd get together and someone would read a classic book, or you'd get together in a synagogue, someone would read the Law of Moses. You'd get together in a church building, someone would read the entire Bible, Old Testament, New Testament. And this was so widespread that, at the end of the 4th century, you have a translation into the Latin Vulgate that was a subsequent translation to the ancient Latin translation that already existed at that time. And the text was not fluid, so what happened at the end of the 4th century is Jerome was the translator. He produced the Latin Vulgate, a new Latin translation. At the end of the 4th century, and Augustine, famous theologian from North Africa, wrote a letter to Jerome saying that when one word differed in the Latin translation of what we would call Jonah 4 verse 6, there were no chapter or verse divisions, but it was Jonah 4 verse 6, there was one word that differed between the old Latin translation and the Latin Vulgate that had just been, it was a new translation at the time. Members that had been hearing that for generation after generation caused an absolute ruckus in the congregation because one word was different. Now, I want you to think about that. Number one, if you're in a congregation where half the people cannot read, but they know that when one word differed, it Something was different about this newfangled translation. How familiar would they have had to have been with the text of the Bible? And how many times do you think Jonah would have been read for them to notice that one word difference? We get a little bit antsy if someone reads a scripture reading maybe a little bit too long. They read the entire Bible over and over and over and over, and they knew it. And the second thing I want to call to your attention is this is a quality control measure, because if you think and you buy into this idea that the Roman Catholic Church messed with the Bible during the medieval period and they changed it in wholesale ways, how easy would that have been to do if there was an explosion in a congregation over one word? And again, this is just one additional quality control measure to think about when you consider all of that. So the decentralization of the text was a guarantee, as we pointed out last night, that no central bureaucracy could control or alter the message. The revealed word was primary, not the church as a validating institution, particularly in the early centuries. As the medieval age persisted, there was a shift in emphasis from the power of the Roman Catholic Church or to the power of the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy, away from individual engagement with the Word. So I'm going to point out several things about the medieval age and the Bible during the medieval age. And one of those is Jerome, who did this Latin Vulgate translation, suggested that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John kind of correspond to those four living creatures of Ezekiel chapter 1, where you have the cherubim, and they have these four faces, depending on which angle you're looking at them. And you've got a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle face. And he suggested that Matthew is kind of reminiscent of the man. You've got the humanity of Jesus Christ. The lion, you've got a voice crying in the wilderness in the beginning of Mark, and so we'll make that the lion. Suffering servant in Luke, so we'll make him the ox, or associate the ox with him. And then the gospel according to John just kind of soars, and it's majestic, so we'll make him the eagle. And what you have as the medieval manuscripts came along, you have a lot of gospel books. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John put together in a book in monasteries and so on, all over the Western European world. And so this is a depiction from AD 820, and you've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you notice the man and the lion down below, and then the eagle with John, and then the ox with Luke in the lower right-hand side. Or the Irish Book of Kells, which again is a gospel book, very ornate. It's hard to make out the man and the ox and the lion and so on because of the weirdness of the art. But one of the most famous books in the world, the Irish Book of Kells. So the medieval age has been romanticized as a fairy tale world with castles, cathedrals, and cobblestone streets, damsels in distress, knights in shining armor. But in truth, it was a time of many contradictions, combining remarkable artistic beauty with brutality and torture. It was a time of cancel culture to the extreme. Some of these scenes are from the medieval world in which we've traveled. My wife is German. This is the Cologne Cathedral, not far from where she grew up. Gigantic. If you walk into that thing, you look up, and it's like a mile high. It's not quite a mile, but it's gigantic. It's monumental. And you wonder how these things were even built. Notre Dame of Paris, before it burned. And the Loire Valley in near Amboise, France, where you have a lot of castles. And there's me with my Golden State Warriors hat on, doing battle with a knight in shining armor right next to me. This is Rothenburg, which is a city in Germany. And it has medieval walls still intact, and you can climb up above those walls and walk the perimeter of the town. But they also have a medieval crime museum with all kinds of instruments of torture. And you can imagine legitimate criminals being subjected to some of this, but you could also imagine, the Inquisitions and people of faith paying a price with these instruments of torture. This is my wife, Andrea, and you could tell she's in terrible, excruciating pain in that picture. You can just suffering immensely. But I would not want to go down in the drink and have to be subjected to that, or sit on that nice, comfortable chair. But again, it's also an age of tremendous, beautiful artwork, often with a very dark, sinister spiritual implication of the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy. Everything served the purpose of that hierarchy. You have beautiful books. This is a German translation of the Bible that occurred in the 1400s with great artistic work. It's one of my favorite reproductions. And you have a lot of, you have three types of books that predominated during this period in terms of biblical artwork and so on. You have gospel books that contain Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You have apocalypse books that show artwork of Revelation. They knew it was a picture book, and they had a lot of these. And you had psalters with psalms. And so this is a gospel book. And you also had Biblia Pauperum, which were books for poor people with gospel portions. This one during the early years of the printing press, where you have the woodcuts and so on. But that goes back to the medieval period, and then scribes working their fingers to the bone. One thing I will say about the Roman Catholic Church, I'm going to say some negative things about what Catholics stood for during this period, but I will say one positive, and it's a big positive. Roman Catholic scribes copy the scriptures again and again and again, over and over again, and there are scads of manuscripts that come from this period. And so they've done a good service for the rest of us because we have access to those manuscripts. But again, the manuscripts become more beautiful, more ornate, and it's like the difference between walking into a humble building versus a cathedral. You're walking into a cathedral of manuscripts that are just eye candy everywhere. Again, going back to the late period of antiquity, you have this codex of translating the Bible into Gothic. About a century before Odoacer invaded Italy, Ulfilas, who's also known as Wulfila, Little Wolf, translated the Bible into Gothic, which was kind of a pre-Germanic language, in the late 4th century. And Codex Amiatinus, the earliest surviving complete manuscript of the Latin Vulgate Bible that dates between 688 and 716 AD, created in Northumbria, England. Again, medieval Bibles were usually in the Latin Vulgate, and you had a lot of psalters, apocalypse, colorful books, and gospel books. But in the late Middle Ages, people who could afford one might possess a personalized prayer book called a Book of Hours. And again, the Bible in its unfiltered version, entirely with the original context, was not in the picture for the common people. There is the very beginning of the Codex Amiatinus. That supposedly is Ezra, with different sections of the Bible in a modern-looking Bible cabinet. One other feature that you see in the gospel books, and this plays, this point is hardly ever made in regard to how we got the Bible, but I'm going to make the point. There was a famous historian, Eusebius, in the beginning of the 4th century, who wrote a history of the church. And we know a whole lot about the first 3 centuries of the church through Eusebius, because he preserved a lot of this information, used a lot of sources and so on. But besides writing that history of the church, the other thing that he really contributed that is of great value is he came up with these canons of how to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in conjunction with each other. And so they were devised in the early 4th century, and there were 10 canon tables with parallel passages in the 4 gospel accounts. This is before you have chapters and verses, and you could peg an account in Matthew with the account in Mark or Luke or John and so on. Table 1 has episodes in all 4 gospel accounts. Tables 2 through 9, episodes common to 2 or 3. Table 10, episodes unique to 1 gospel account. And so this was kind of a way of cross-referencing different episodes in the 4 gospel accounts prior to modern verse and chapter divisions. So this is what those tables often looked like. Sometimes the medieval artists drew elaborate pictures or made elaborate pictures with the tables. And even as you get into a Latin Bible that I've got from 1546, almost 500 years old, it's still produced in print form, these Eusebian tables at the beginning of the New Testament. And this is from the Codex Sinaiticus, early 4th century, almost the time of Eusebius himself. And you see the little side marginal notes. Those are Eusebian canon table numbers. We don't have the actual charts. Those pages may have been lost. But in the 4th century, this was already in vogue, already in one of the most important manuscripts in the world. And it continued throughout the medieval period and into the early 15th century. Every paragraph in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John has a Eusebian canon number. Could anyone have messed with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John if you see this throughout this entire period? You understand what I'm saying? The Roman Catholic Church could not have messed with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and changed the fundamental message, because every paragraph in all of these are keyed to a Eusebian canon table number. All right, enough on that for now. But here's the printed Latin Bible that I have from 1546. It has, again, a Eusebian number right on the left of Matthew chapter 1. And the chapter and verse divisions come later. Stephen Langton, generally credited for the chapter divisions, 1228. He died. He's also responsible for a little document called the Magna Carta. And credit for the verse divisions goes to a French printer named Robert Estienne, or Robertus Stephanus in Latin, 1551. The first English Bible that incorporated that was the Geneva Bible, 1560. Prior to the verse divisions, you would have chapters divided into A, B, C, and D, and so on. So when you're reading William Tyndale's writings, for example, he would speak of like Matthew 5b, Matthew 7a, and you couldn't pinpoint the verses because there were no verse divisions there. They were added in the 1550s. So I want to talk a little bit about John Wycliffe. He was a Roman Catholic theologian, a teacher, priest. And he was a reformer to a degree. He saw through many of the errors of Roman Catholicism and tried to preach the truth as best as he understood it. And an opponent of John Wycliffe in the early 15th century complained that the pearl of the gospel that Christ gave to the doctors and clergy of the church was being scattered abroad and trodden underfoot by swine. The common people had no need of the Bible, it was argued. After all, they had stained glass windows in cathedrals, biblical scenes painted on walls, plays depicting scriptural stories, passion plays. Looking back on this period, we may, admire Romanesque and Gothic architecture, colorful manuscripts, huge castles, knights in shining armor, and other vestiges of medieval society. But the repression of biblical truth was a very real, tragic reality in that day and age. People wanted to read the Bible as it was originally given. The Old Testament, the 4 gospel accounts, the Acts of the Apostles, the epistles, the book of Revelation. And so when scholars associated with Wycliffe translated the scriptures from the Latin Vulgate, not from the original Greek and the Hebrew, but from the Latin Vulgate, into the Middle English in the 1380s, 1382 probably, the original version, and it was revised just a few years after that. The manuscripts were painstakingly handwritten, as the printing press would not come around until the 1455 or so, and a New Testament from William Tyndale not until 1526. So we're a century and a half removed from that. So in spite of intense efforts to ban them, and burn those who read them, copies of Wycliffe Bibles were abundant. About 20 manuscripts survive of the entire Bible, almost 90 of the New Testament, almost 250 or over 250 of single books of the Bible. If you could get your hands in the 1380s of a single book of the Bible, you were rich, indeed, in more ways than one. And yet, everybody wanted one. It's a larger number of copies than for any other medieval English text, the Wycliffe Bible. As David Daniel observes, these Wycliffe Bibles came with obvious care, written on vellum to last, and generally free from additional matter. They contain nothing to identify the translator, the place of origin, or the date. The silence is noteworthy because the focus would be on the text, the sacred text. So Wycliffe launched a movement that could not be extinguished, and he's remembered as the morning star of the Reformation. Henry Knighton, the Catholic chronicler, said Christ gave his gospel to the clergy and the learned doctors of the church so that they might give it to the laity and to weaker persons according to the message of the season and personal need. But this master, John Wycliffe, and there's an alternative spelling of Wycliffe, by the way, translated the gospel from Latin into English, the Angle but not the angel language, and Wycliffe, by thus translating the Bible, made it the property of the masses and common to all and more open to the laity and even to women who were able to read. Can you imagine? And so the pearl of the gospel is thrown before swine and trodden underfoot, and what is meant to be the treasure both of clergy and laity has now become a joke to both. You think the Catholics wanted the common people to have the Bible in their own language? Think again. And I believe it was a means of control. They looked at English as a vulgar common language, the language people spoke, the language people cussed and swore in. You got to have something holy like the Latin language that most people couldn't understand, in which everything done in the church would be in Latin pretty much. And so when scholars, he launched this movement, it could not be extinguished. And the Catholic Church tried hard to destroy his work, discredit him. Under the influence of Archbishop Arundel, 1407 ruling forbade the translation of any text of Holy Scripture into the English or other language by way of book, pamphlet, or tract, and that no book, pamphlet, or tract of this kind be read either recently composed at the time of the said John Wycliffe, or since then, or that in future may be composed under pain of greater excommunication. And so to add insult to history, and this comes from, you've heard of Fox's Book of Martyrs maybe. That's an abridgment of Fox's Acts and Monument. And there are woodcuts in that book. This is a woodcut of Wycliffe's body exhumed 44 years after his death. His remains were burned and his ashes were scattered over the River Swift. But that was not the end of it. There was a movement that continued on, and called the Lollards. You have even Inquisitions tried to stamp out dissent, but they had the opposite effect. An Englishman of the time complained that a man could not meet two people on the road, but one of them was a disciple of Wycliffe. Wycliffe's writings were banned and burned in England, but caught on in Bohemia, where Jan Hus launched a pre-Reformation back to the Bible movement of his own. And then in the century following, the 15th century, the 1400s, followers of Wycliffe were known as Lollards, which was a derogatory term, meaning ranters probably. Many of them continued to attend Catholic Mass, as well as their own illegal conventicles, which were assemblies, meetings often late at night, focused on memorizing Scripture in their native English. And when they were reading the Bible and memorizing it, they came to some weird conclusions in many cases. Not all Lollards had these beliefs, but many did. No images. No expensive church buildings. No need for holy days. No confession to a priest. No allegiance to the Pope. No prayers for the dead. No infant baptism. No Latin Mass. We need to do this in English. And some of them came to this really bizarre conclusion: no instruments of music. In 1407, this Bishop Arundel that persecuted the Lollards, this guy named William Thorpe was on trial, and John Fox talks about it in this Acts and Monuments. On trial for being a Lollard. You don't approve of musical instruments? No, sir. Why not? He came up with an argument I would never think of using, but this is what he said nonetheless. When Jesus went into the home of Jairus, they had professional mourners playing instruments everywhere. And Jesus put out the minstrels. And we need to do the same. Now again, I would not use that argument per se, but his whole point was we don't need all that nonsense. Interesting that people just reading the Bible would come to that conclusion in the early 1400s. The tide began to turn when one disruptive technology changed everything. Once the Bible began to be printed, it was harder to control people and crush dissent. This is in Mainz, Germany. And there is a statue of the Gutenberg, Johann Gutenberg, and there's a Gutenberg Museum there, and the printing press. And Gutenberg's dream was to print the Bible. He printed other books, of course, but the Latin Vulgate was the first book to come off the printing press. And Gutenberg said, God suffers in the multitude of souls whom his holy word cannot reach. Religious truth is imprisoned in a small number of manuscript books which confine instead of spread the public treasure. Let us break the seal which seals up holy things and give wings to truth in order that she may go and win every soul that comes into this world by her word. It's no longer written at great expense by a hand easily palsied, but multiplied like the wind by an untiring machine. He said of the printing press, yes, it is a press, certainly, but a press from which shall soon flow in inexhaustible streams the most abundant and most marvelous liquor that has ever flowed to relieve the thirst of men. Through it, God will spread his word. A spring of pure truth shall flow from it. Like a new star, it shall scatter the darkness of ignorance and cause a light heretofore unknown to shine amongst men. In the year 2000, the end of the millennium, I think it was Time magazine or maybe it was U.S. News and World Report, did a kind of a thing about the most important person of that millennium from 1000 to 2000. And Gutenberg got number 1 for putting the printing press here. But again, the first book that came off that was the Latin Vulgate Bible. Just a few years later, 1514, Cardinal Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros, who was the Grand Inquisitor in Spain, printed this book. I've got a copy of the New Testament version of it, the Complutensian Polyglot Bible. And the Old Testament has a number of different translations. The New Testament has the Latin and the Greek. This is the first printing of the Greek New Testament, 1514. Erasmus came up with his version of it in 1516. That brings the whole manuscript era to an end. You no longer needed handwritten manuscripts because you have printed versions of Greek. And it was the Erasmus text in 1516 that Luther used to translate the Bible into German, and that Martin Luther used to translate or that William Tyndale used to translate the Bible into English. Erasmus lived and died a Catholic, but he wanted to get the Bible into the language of the common people. He said, I wish that they were translated into all the languages of all people, that they might read and be read and known, not merely by the Scotch and the Irish, but even by the Turks and the Saracens. I wish that the husbandman may sing parts of them at the plow, that the weaver may warble them at the shuttle, the traveler may, with their narratives, beguile the weariness of the way. And so Bibles began to be printed. And this is the one Bible that I have from 1546. It's a Roman Catholic Bible in Latin, produced in Lyon, France. You have the woodcuts of the 6 days of creation, and again, Matthew 1. But this back to the Bible movement was huge. People were now accessing the Bible, and the proliferation of Bibles meant that more and more people were actually reading them, reading the Bible for themselves, and a whole world of ideas dawned on them. This spawned a back to the Bible movement, and no one was going to stop it. No one at this point. Archbishop Fitzralph of Armagh in the early 14th century said, I used to think that I had penetrated the depths of your truth with the citizens of your heaven, until you, the solid truth, shone upon me in your scriptures, scattering the cloud of my error and showing me how I was croaking in the marshes with the toads and frogs. It opened up a whole new world. Yes, there was cancel culture on steroids. And people paid a heavy price in some cases for reading the Bible in their own language. The Roman Catholic Church did not want this. And we'll get into that more tomorrow night when we talk about the Bible into English and the price that was paid for that to happen. But in 1524, Martin Luther translates the Bible into his native German. And this is a version from 1534. And this man, William Tyndale, we're going to talk about him tomorrow night. Martin Luther started a Reformation in 1517 in Wittenberg, Germany, in response to Johann Tetzel's abusive plea, as the coin in the coffer rings, so the soul from purgatory springs. And you have two very different attitudes. On the one hand, Ignatius Loyola, who started a counter-Reformation, said, I will believe the white object I see is black if that should be the decision of the hierarchical church. Martin Luther, on the other hand, said, unless I am proved wrong by Scripture and plain reason, I cannot and will not recant, so help me God. Stubborn fellow, that Luther. But this man, William Tyndale, was a contemporary of Luther and wanted to do what Luther did. I don't agree with all of Luther's theology. He fought one extreme by going too far to the other extreme in terms of the Catholic doctrine of works versus salvation by faith alone. But at least he translated the Bible into his native German and opened up a spirit of open investigation. And William Tyndale did the same thing in the English world. And we'll explore that tomorrow evening. That's one of my favorite figures from all of church history, William Tyndale, and stay tuned for tomorrow night. Concluding observations on tonight's lesson: the Roman Catholic Church did not produce the Bible, they suppressed it. But at least their scribes preserved it by copying it again and again and again. The hunger for the Bible was repressed until it just blew up like a cork. And the original context, the hunger for the Bible in the original context was intense. Eventually there was no stopping the inevitable. And eventually, at great cost, Bibles were produced in languages other than Latin, including English. And that's the story we'll resume tomorrow evening. I'm done tonight. I hope that you gained something from tonight's lesson. If you're subject to the invitation call of Jesus Christ, then you have an opportunity to read this book on your own, to engage with it on your own, and to come to terms with God's promises and His conditions of salvation, His plan of salvation. You can believe and be baptized for the remission of your sins, and we're here to help you if we possibly can. Let's stand and sing a song of invitation together.